So let me introduce our first speaker. Ryan Ness is the Director of Adaptation with the Canadian Climate Institute. Ryan has 20 years of experience in climate adaptation, environmental management, and strategy development, and was previously the lead for climate adaptation programs and corporate strategy at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, including heading the Secretariat of the Ontario Climate Consortium. He's a professional engineer holding a bachelor's and master's degrees in environmental engineering and water resources engineering from the University of Guelph, and is completing a PhD in environment, resources, and sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And Ryan is going to tell us about the damage control report, projecting the future costs of climate change in Canada. How can the future costs of climate inaction and the benefits of adaptation be estimated? Please join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara, and thanks everybody for being here today and for being a part of this event. I'm going to talk about, like Kara said, some work that we at the Canadian Climate Institute did on assessing the potential future costs of climate change for Canada and some of the benefits of adaptation. I guess the reason for doing that goes back to the reason for being for the Canadian Climate Institute. For those who don't know, the Institute is an independent think tank that is funded by the federal government, but operates entirely separate from it. We're governed by our own board of directors. We decide on our own research agenda based on what is needed to inform the federal government and other governments across Canada on sort of the most important policy decisions and choices that need to be made around pursuing our climate change goals, whether that be mitigation or adaptation. And so when the smart people who came together to create the idea for the Institute were developing its initial mandate, many of those people, or some of those people, are in this room. They identified as a challenge for the adaptation side of what the Institute would do is raising the profile of adaptation before it could be a more mature public policy conversation in Canada, because it just wasn't getting the same amount of attention and priority as reducing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. So really, we used there we go. We use the cost of climate change really as a blunt instrument to elevate the conversation about adaptation in this country by highlighting the economic unsustainability of doing nothing on adaptation, even if the world gets emissions under control. And then by highlighting the benefits, the return on investment of adaptation and how essential it is to act on adaptation without delay. So we developed a series of reports looking at sort of sector or issue specific impacts, as well as wrapping it up with the report damage control that estimated the macroeconomic implications, the cost, the damage to our overall economy from the sort of accumulation of those individual costs and damages in different areas. And this is a more complex slide than it needs to be. I think the big takeaway here is that we used an approach that looked at both this bottom-up assessment, sector by sector or impact area by impact area, of direct costs and damages, but also rolled them up into a top-down analysis of macroeconomic impacts for the country, following a method used in many other similar studies that have been done in Europe, where this kind of work has been ongoing for a decade or more. So our approach was to, and up on the top of the screen, if you can't see it, we'll say 16 bottom-up impact areas. These are the areas that we focused on for that bottom-up analysis, using future climate projections and climate impact models and economic costing techniques to estimate the costs of impacts in all of these different areas in terms of direct costs and damages, and then ultimately macroeconomic costs as well. This is sort of an example of the information that came out of the sector specific work. This is some of the infrastructure costing results, all of which showed that infrastructure damage across sort of key infrastructure types. This one shows buildings and real estate in particular in terms of its effects on flooding could accelerate rapidly. The blue graphs are under a low emission scenario. The orange graphs are a high emission scenario. That's a protocol that will be followed on the other graphs that you see. So it shows that not only will damage increase significantly in a high emission scenario, as one might expect, by up to a factor of 10 or more in terms of annual flood damage. And as Chris was saying earlier, that damage is already appreciable now. Imagine sort of an order of magnitude of increase in that damage. But even in a low emission scenario where emissions are brought under control, the effects of climate change on the things that drive flooding, like rainfall and storms, are sort of leveled off. We still continue to see a major increase in annual flood damage before things do reach sort of an equilibrium. So that's the infrastructure side. On the assessment of health, we looked at impacts of declining air quality, impacts of increasing frequency of extreme heat, and new diseases or expanding diseases like Lyme disease. And what we found, especially when it comes to heat and air quality, that if you value the costs of impacts on health and loss of life appropriately, the costs of climate change impacts on people's health across the country could significantly exceed even the major costs of physical infrastructure damage. And then rolling that up to a sort of macroeconomic scale, doing macroeconomic modeling, plugging in the damages and disruption across different sectors of the economy shows that there are significant impacts on Canada's economy, on GDP growth, not just for or from weather-related disasters, as you can see in the top bar here, which is what people most often associate with economic damage, but other slower onset or less dramatic impacts of climate change, like the impacts of heat, for example, on labor productivity, sort of a slow, silent impact of climate change, but a significant one on GDP overall. We even looked at some optimistic scenarios where some of the projections about the benefits of climate change may come true on improving agricultural yields, increasing our ability to generate hydroelectricity and possibly boosting tourism in Canada. But even under best case scenarios for those, you can see that the negative impacts of costs and damage far outweigh them. And so there's an affordability story there. In addition to sort of on the top, you can see the impacts to sort of traditional macroeconomic indicators. We'd lose GDP, we'd lose our ability to export and generate revenue that way. Jobs would be lost, but that also hits at the household and small business level. Household income would go down. Investment and the ability of private capital to be put to good use rather than to fixing broken things would decline. And the size of government would need to increase just to fill sort of all the gaps left in services and repairing damages, things like disaster financial assistance, like we're talked about this morning. So that's sort of the summary of the cost side of our work. But we always try to emphasize that we were really only able to scratch the surface. Even though the costs and damages are big and scary, we really can only start to quantify some of the risks, the climate-related risks in Canada's path. There are many others that we just don't have the data or understanding or tools to be able to assess. Things like the impacts of increasing climate disasters on mental health, for example, to bring up something that was mentioned this morning, or international effects like the effects of global geopolitical instability and war that might drive climate migration or interrupt international supply chains. So there's much more to be understood. And so even though the tip of the iceberg should be enough to inspire action, we need to be aware that there is much more that may lie beneath the surface. On the good news side of our work, looking at different ways of intervening early to proactively adapt, whether it be infrastructure or health systems. This is just an example of some very simple things that can be done to upgrade the materials that our roads are paved with to account for future extreme heat. And what you can see is you can actually reverse the trend of increasing climate-related costs to that infrastructure over time, and actually reduce the climate-related damage. This is associated with heat alone to road networks. So getting out ahead of the problem can save literally billions of dollars. And if you look at that at a macroeconomic scale, the return on adaptation investment is even greater. On the bottom, it shows the direct benefits of adaptation that resulted from our analysis if you sort of average out all the different adaptation interventions we looked at. So reducing the direct costs and damages to a particular sector or the people who are directly affected by climate-related damage, like those who are impacted by flooding, could result in $5 of return for $1 spent. But if you look at the economy-wide benefits of reduced disruption, supply chain interruption, loss of labor productivity, and the ability to use capital for new productive uses and innovation rather than fixing what is broken, you boost the return on investment by a factor of 3, essentially, for $15 for each dollar invested. So some of the key takeaways that we took out of that work and used to connect with decision makers, with industry leaders, to try to, again, elevate the profile of adaptation in Canada, and hopefully that's been successful. First is that, yes, there are long-term implications of climate change, and damages will increase, but those damages are already happening. And as Chris showed this morning, there's ample data to suggest that we're already in an era of much greater climate-related damage and risk than we were in the past. Income, affordability, and prosperity will decline across the country. That is inevitable as a result of all of these impacts. And there are no good scenarios. Even if emissions are brought under control, even if some of the positive benefits or positive outcomes of climate change that might be realized in Canada occur, there's still a net negative outcome for all scenarios where we don't adapt. And then the good news side of that is that with proactive adaptation and with a lower emissions future, a situation in which the global community gets emissions under control, the cost of climate change, the damages, the impact on our economy will be reduced by up to 75%. And just in closing, these are some of the actions, the recommendations we're making for government and governments emerging from that work. One is that climate impacts and adaptation need to be built into all economic decision making. The risks of building new things and the benefits of investing more in making those new things adaptive, or investing in making our existing infrastructure resilient, need to be taken into account all the time. The private sector needs to be driven to include that risk in their decision making as well. Adaptation needs to be dramatically scaled up in Canada. The level of investment, both public and private, in adaptation is nowhere near the amount of economic risk that we've pointed out. We need to, in addition to adaptation, continue to drive both domestic and international emissions reductions, because we can't successfully adapt to a 4-degree warmer world. We need the combination of adaptation and mitigation to be successful. And then we still need to invest in better understanding the costs and the risks under the surface of the waterline on that iceberg, to not only better understand the overall magnitude of the potential cost of doing nothing and the benefits of adaptation, but to know more about where we should prioritize our efforts and our investments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure you have a few questions. Note them down. We're going to go straight to our next speaker, and then we'll hear from one more, and then we'll get your questions and discussion going. So talk to us about the cost of climate change on the prairies, Richard Boyd is the Director of Research and Economics at All One Sky Foundation. Richard is a recognized expert on the economics of climate change with 30 years experience evaluating the costs of inaction, as well as the cost, benefits, and distributional impacts of adaptation and mitigation strategies to inform decision-making at all levels of government. Richard recently completed studies of the economic risks of climate change for both Calgary and Edmonton, and served as lead author for the costs and benefits of climate impacts and adaptation chapter in Canada's National Climate Change Knowledge Assessment. Over his career, Richard has led economic analyses of climate change impacts and adaptation for infrastructure and the built environment, human health, water resources and quality, agriculture, and ecosystem services, both within Canada and internationally. Welcome, Richard Boyd.
Thank you for the introduction there, Kara, and good afternoon, everyone. As Kara said there, I'm going to talk a little bit here about the costs of climate change for the prairie provinces, but also then start to look at, well, how do we use that information to inform decision making to sort of set up the next presentation by Amber. But to start with, I think many of you will have heard the term the costs of inaction. And I just wanted to say that that's actually used interchangeably with reference to the costs of climate change. This is a term that's more common within the economics literature, but I'm also seeing it a lot within municipal RFPs and also, ICLEI's guidelines, for example. They've got a guideline on the cost of inaction. There's formal definitions as to what that is, but it's best to think of it as a sort of the costs of continuing with a business as usual approach, both with respect to local adaptation and climate mitigation. In terms of like how useful information is on the cost of inaction, within an adaptation planning context, it can be put to multiple uses. So for a start, we can use information on the cost of inaction to quantify the sort of overall scale of the problem that's presented by the physical risks of climate change and express that in units which are familiar to decision makers in terms of dollars. It's also useful to inform the distributional impacts of climate change, both in terms of like regions, population groups, climate sensitive sectors, which can be used to then prioritize adaptation actions. It's also used within a climate risk management context to prioritize both climate hazards or threats, as well as any beneficial opportunities that may be presented by climate change. And in fact, we've been actually embedding information on the cost of inaction within impact scenarios when we're doing climate risk assessments for municipalities as a means of sort of scoring the consequences associated with those impact scenarios. And then finally, it's useful to sort of inform the overall level of investment within adaptation, but also in terms of the sort of timing and sequencing of specific adaptation actions. So it serves a range of multiple purposes within an adaptation planning context. So what are the costs of climate change for the prairies? Well, the current state of knowledge is summarized there on the slide. These estimates are primarily from the bottom-up type studies that Ryan was referring to, sector-specific process modeling at a sectoral level. A couple of things to note here about the estimates that are shown. Those are annual costs, and they are annual costs in 2020 billions of dollars for the different sectors that are shown. Where there's two numbers shown, the one on the left is the projected cost for 2050s, the one on the right is the projected cost for the 2080s. Now, I can't possibly go through all of these and explain the background to them, but I believe there's a report coming out from ClimateWest soon, which provides the detail for those who are interested in pursuing it. A couple of things to note. As Ryan alluded to as well, the largest losses are projected to occur within the public health sector across the impacts that have been monetized. And you can see that there at the top. By 2050, you're looking at about $11.5 billion losses annually with respect to impacts of high temperature exposure, exposure to air quality changes as a result of rising temperatures, so that's ground level ozone, and increased incidence of Lyme disease. Something else to note, the studies that are available for the prairies, nearly all of them indicate a beneficial impact for agriculture. And you can see there, the third one there from the bottom, the study suggesting that the agricultural farmland values are going to increase by $3.4 billion by mid-century relative to a no climate change world. Word of caution here, these studies only look at changes in mean variables. So that's changes in seasonal temperatures, changes in seasonal total precipitation, growing degree days. They do not account for the other challenges that climate change will present the agricultural sector. It's like things like extreme drought, moderate drought, water availability, pests and disease, and also increased intensity, frequency of extreme storm events. So be cautious in thinking about the impacts of climate change on agriculture as being beneficial. So moving on, looking at what that means in aggregate for the prairie provinces, when you sum up those bottom-up costs, you're looking at about an overall aggregate loss of about $16 billion annually by mid-century. The majority of those losses accrue to Alberta, which is expected. It has the largest population, it has the largest asset inventory, and the largest economy. But what those aggregate numbers aren't showing is that on a per capita basis, the largest losses are in Manitoba. And that's because the projected changes in the climate hazards above a threshold level for impact, those projected changes are larger in Manitoba for exposed systems than they are in Saskatchewan and Alberta. There's also been some detailed work, like my introduction sort of alluded to there, looking at the costs of climate change at the municipal level for both Calgary and Edmonton. And these studies looked at a multitude of different climate hazards, impacts upon a multitude of different climate systems, both human systems, assets in built environment assets, and also the natural environment. And you can see there that the two bold numbers in the center of those donut charts, estimated losses for Edmonton are about $3.4 billion annually by mid-century and $2.6 billion for Calgary annually by mid-century. And consistent with the numbers I showed you for the prairies as a whole, the majority of these impacts is related to impacts upon public health. And then also significant impacts here with respect to damages to the city tree canopy and also natural areas within the city, including wetlands, grasslands, and shrublands. The stuff I've been presenting so far, the numbers, they're direct costs. But those direct costs, especially the tangible costs resulting from damages to infrastructure, impairment of people's productivity within the workforce, they give rise to macroeconomic impacts, as Ryan was showing. And in the case of Calgary and Edmonton, the two tables at the bottom are showing the resulting macroeconomic impacts across the province associated with the direct tangible costs within each of the cities. And so looking at Calgary, for example, the direct tangible costs or impacts mid-century are giving rise to losses of about $2.2 billion in 2055 in terms of the Prairie's GDP. And there's also impacts upon a range of other different macroeconomic indicators as well. So it's not about just the direct costs, there's also these secondary ripple effects that have economic consequences across the economy. Again, it's like the tip of the iceberg sort of slides that Ryan was talking about. What I've shown you is really only hinting at the scale of the overall problem. There are multiple reasons as to why we are underestimating the future cost of climate change. Some of them are listed there on the slide. And just for example, with respect to damages to infrastructure, we're not capturing the value we attach to disruptions to the services they provide. We would all be quite willing to pay some amount of money to avoid disruption to electricity supply or water supply. Those losses are not captured within the estimates. Also quite important, we're not capturing compounding effects like have been experienced recently within BC. where you've got back-to-back climate hazards occurring, or a same climate hazard occurring in sequence like the multiple atmospheric rivers that hit BC a few years back. Those sort of compounding impacts will have costs greater than the sum of the individual parts, and that again is not being captured within the current investigations. So moving on to how we might start to use this information. Hopefully, between Ryan and myself, and Chris earlier, we've demonstrated that there's a clear need for adaptation, at least from an economic perspective. And there's a study out a few years ago by the Insurance Bureau of Canada and FCM, which was suggesting that municipalities need to invest the equivalent of about 0.26% of GDP annually in adaptations to safeguard their municipal assets and services against projected climate change. So if we take that number and we apply it to some of the main population centers within the prairies, over like a 10-year investment plan, you can see there, like Calgary, for example, you're looking at about $2.8 billion of investment in adaptation. Saskatoon, close to $0.5 billion. Winnipeg, about $1 billion over 10 years. That's the sort of scale of investment that this study is suggesting. The good news is that those investments generate reasonable rates of return. And the slide here is just showing some of the rates of return from $1 invested in proactive adaptation from a range of different studies. And as you can see there, investing $1 is generating just under $2 in return, upwards of $10 or more, primarily for investment in nature-based solutions with relatively lower capital costs, and also the provision of ancillary co-benefits. So what happens if we take our estimate of the sort of required level of investment that's being suggested, and we combine that with those rates of return? What does that mean for the level of adaptation investment in a city like Edmonton? And this is what I've got here on the slide. And so the sort of top row there is looking at, well, what happens if Edmonton did invest 0.26% of projected GDP over the next 10 years in an adaptation? That amounts to about $1.8 billion, or just under $1,600 per person. And as you slide out there to the right, at reasonable rates of return from the literature between $3 and $5, you can see there in the green that the reductions in projected damages over the lifetimes of those adaptations is only 18 to 30%. So you're still left with quite a large residual loss, even at that level of investment and those rates of return shown by the red bars on the right. But what happens if Edmonton invested 1% of projected GDP in adaptation over the next 10 years? That amounts to about $7 billion, or just around $6,000 per person. At the same sort of typical rates of return of $3 to $5, as you move there out to the right, you can see that the reductions in projected losses over the lifetimes of those measures is the sort of 70 to 100%. So in theory, that level of investment at rates of return of $5, you could, in theory, not necessarily in practice, have zero residual losses attributable to climate change. And so this is just like an illustration of how one can start to use information on the costs of inaction to sort of inform the level of potential adaptation and the level of return you should seek on your adaptation investments. Starred there at the bottom, you're looking for about at least 1% in the case of Edmonton, and returns of at least $4 for every dollar invested. And that's it.
Okay, wow, those are some big numbers in terms of costs and what to invest in adaptation. So let's hear from our third speaker, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. How can we use this information to spur action in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba? To speak to us about that, Amber Bennett, the Deputy Director of Re.Climate, is here. And Amber is one of Canada's top climate communication strategists and capacity builders. Over the past 5 years, she's worked to bring groups and leaders across the country together to build a diverse network of more than 1,900 climate communicators. As a manager of the Alberta Narratives Project, She worked to bring together more than 75 individuals and organizations to engage 500 Albertans in climate energy conversations, making it one of the largest public engagements of its kind. Over the past 20 years, her work has delivered new research, critical capacity and skills, partnerships, and campaigns. She earned multiple awards and regularly speaks on the topic of climate communications. Amber holds a Bachelor of Public Relations and a Master's of Arts in Environmental Education and Communication. Please join me in welcoming Amber Bennett.
Well, thank you. This is going to be a sharp turn from the graphs and numbers and billions of dollars. So bear with me, but hopefully it's useful. So just to say, Re.Climate is Canada's new center for climate communications and engagement at Carleton University. We launched last November, and our focus is on bringing the toolkit of social sciences and the work that's underway to think about how we communicate and how we engage effectively. I'm also remarkably shorter than the other presenters. And so the intention of our work is to build a social mandate. And what that entails is that people are informed and they understand and that they are engaged in the conversations that are shaping their lives around climate change. So just before we begin, what I will say is I think that the narrative overall has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. So I did a series of interviews with people who had experienced catastrophic flooding in Calgary in the 2013 floods. And at that time, it was really apparent that there was very little appetite, either by government or by the people themselves, to talk about the flood as a climate change event, or to engage with it in the sense that this is likely to happen again. It was very much about going back to normal as quickly as possible and going back to the status quo. Fast forward to 2021 in British Columbia, it was a much different narrative. I remember distinctly driving in my car and listening to a briefing that the Premier and the Prime Minister were hosting at the time. And right off the bat, they addressed the event as something that we are likely to see again in the future, that now is the time to be coming together, but also to be coming together to prepare and to build resilience for future events that will happen. So they announced, I think, a joint ministry panel on climate disaster and on climate change at the time. But it was very much addressed head on and talked about as something that is likely to happen in the future. I believe that in that 10 years, partly because of the work that we're all doing here, the public narrative has shifted, but not enough. So the next few slides that I'm going to show you is kind of where Canadians right now on this issue. What are the things that are helpful, or kind of what are the tailwinds kind of supporting this work, and what are the headwinds? What are the things that are holding us back, or barriers that we need to have communication strategies in place to address? So more or less, what we know is that concern about climate change is at a supermajority. Most Canadians, and I would say, yes, this is true for Alberta. Yes, this is true for Saskatchewan and for Manitoba. I mean, this region is slightly different, but not dramatically different than the rest of Canada. So you see this across multiple surveys, consistently high levels of concern about climate. What's driving that concern is extreme weather. So this is a quote, the more extreme winters we're seeing, the more extreme summers. I was born and raised in Edmonton. I've never seen that before. So regular Canadians are making sense of climate change through their experiences of extreme weather. There's also high levels of belief, supermajority beliefs around climate change making extreme weather worse. And reports of experiencing extreme weather events in the past year, all of these are pointing to the fact that Canadians are making sense of climate change through their experiences. We also have the majority of people, 9 out of 10 Canadians, are saying that yes, climate change is happening. The problem is that almost half of those people, or 36%, would attribute it to both human and natural causes. So there's still not necessarily a strong belief that this is anthropogenic or that it's humans, and that has implications in terms of the kinds of solutions people are thinking about when it comes to climate. The other piece that in terms of a headwind or things that are holding us back is that for the most part, Canadians do not think of this as something that's relevant to them. This is a problem that will happen to other people in other places. And what I would say is even people who experience natural disasters will still distance the problem or the likelihood of it happening to them in the future. The other thing is that climate change trails other issues. So affordability, inflation, those are obviously very top priorities for most Canadians right now. Healthcare, education, et cetera. This particular piece of research came out of Alberta, but you'll see the same thing anywhere else, right? So it's like climate change, yes, is a priority, but it's not quite enough of a priority that I will put it at the top of my list if somebody asks me. And then finally, there's a political divide. So for most, so if you ask people what is a major threat, depending on where they sit on the political spectrum, 80% of the political left would say that yes, climate change is a major threat, whereas 46% of the people on the political right would say it's a major threat. And you can see that play out in kind of political discourse and et cetera. So there's this kind of identity shift around how important this is for you, depending on where you sit in your political values. So why is it that we can be making sense of climate change? We can be experiencing extreme weather events, but yet at the same time, it's not relevant. It's not my problem. It's not likely to happen to me again. It's not a high priority, and I'm not even sure if it's real. We have lots of defenses. So human beings have lots of ways that we can manage really difficult information. And this is, there's lots of lots to say about this, but I would say the key takeaway is that we have all kinds of ways to both understand something and also not feel something about it, right? These are the ways that we protect ourselves. And this is extremely important when it relates to this conversation, because basically everything that I've heard today is not great news. And so Canadians are kind of protecting themselves a little bit, as are decision makers and leaders in government. Nobody wants to be the Debbie Downer who goes into a room and just delivers bad news. Neither do political leaders want to go in and deliver all of the risk, right? So these are our natural human responses, but there's also lots of tools that we have or strategies that we have to kind of address them and get through them. Yes, so this is my moment to deliver my message. So I think that we are now at a point in our lives where, yeah, the mega narrative is climate change is happening. And these natural disasters are a part of this. But I think what we have not done sufficiently and what we need to do to kind of move through the next period of time is that we need to harden off the narrative that we are never, ever going back. Even the language of change allows people to think about this as something that, oh, it changed this way, it can change back. Or as long as we put enough solar panels on our house, it's going to go back to normal. We need to get to the point where we feel comfortable and are having a public conversation that these kinds of disasters and the things that we're experiencing are going to be with us for my generation, my children's generation, their children, and their children, or their children. We are no longer building out a future like the one that we had in the past. And the Canadian public does not know this. They really do not understand that we have moved into an entirely different climate. that we are already experiencing, and it is not going to get better. It's not going to go back. And so part of the message, if you could take anything away from what I'm saying right now, is we need to get much more comfortable having a conversation with people, that we are building out infrastructure, that we are making decisions that are based on preparing and protecting and safety and around our health for the future that we have right now. That's what I wanted to say. So 5 tips. How we frame this conversation depends largely on your audience. So for some people in this room, it is an economic conversation. For most people, this is not an economic conversation at all. This is about protecting my family. It's about having a safe home. It's about security in terms of my children. It's about even just security in terms of our country. It's about public health, and it's about preparing. So depending on who your audience is, and we need to do a very good job of understanding what they care about, how you frame the conversation will be different. Next, and there was a beautiful example of this with Mary this morning. Stories are probably the best tool we have in our arsenal to communicate about this. I'm pretty sure that no one is going to leave this room forgetting the story that Mary shared this morning. But with all due respect, the graphs and the charts that have been shared are kind of forgettable, right? They're kind of forgettable. So that's not to say that we don't share graphs and charts and data, but we have to combine it with powerful stories that people can relate to, because stories tell us why we care. They give us a moral imperative. They allow us to put our shoes in that person's life, to walk in their life, to tell stories about people like me, people, that my community, etc. So they give us the why, they give us the motivation, they give us the moral imperative, and the data and the analysis shows us how to move forward. It's how we make decisions. It's the evidence in which we're making and basing our decisions, but it's not really motivating for a lot of people, and it's often forgettable. Next is pick a trusted messenger. Again, understand your audience. This is going to be very different for different audiences, right? If you're talking to an agricultural community, pick a farmer. If you're talking to the public, you might want to engage firefighters, or you might want to engage healthcare professionals. You might want to engage kind of new, different, unusual voices, people who maybe had experienced something, community leaders that have done some of the work of adaptation, of proactively doing something and then saving money from it. Pick people that people can relate to, and then allow them to talk about really boring practical things, right? So I think Canadians don't necessarily, I've gone way over time, I'm sorry. I'll wrap it up really quickly. So pick a trusted messenger, firefighters, healthcare professionals, make them unusual, and just let them talk about boring things, because people want to hear people's lived experience. They want it to be non-political. They just want somebody who's authentic and credible. Next, who do people trust? They trust scientists and academics. They do not trust politicians, and they, for the most part, don't trust environmental groups, and they don't trust media. Finally, use plain, powerful language. Rather than talking about adaptation, talk about actions to reduce risk and vulnerability. Rather than emissions, talk about pollution. Nobody sees anything when you say pollution, emissions. It's kind of invisible. But when you talk about pollution, it actually gives you a mental model of something that's happening. Oh, sorry. Rather than extreme weather or climate impacts or adaptation, talk about floods and fires and hurricanes and droughts and storms. People can kind of hear that. Make it visual. So climate change is not about polar bears. It's not about graphs. It's not about charts. There's a whole visual storytelling element that we can mobilize that allows people to better understand what it is that we're talking about. Thank you.
Wow, great presentations. Okay, so we are going to take some time to ask some questions, get our panelists to give us some more advice on how we handle all this information and communicate it in a way that spurs actions in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions or online on the Mentimeter. If you want to ask a question verbally on Zoom, just write it in the chat and we can let us know that you want to be shown on screen. So here comes one of the first questions. What accounts, panelists, for the almost 1 billion difference in loss between Calgary and City of Edmonton? So I think this is for you, Richard, the difference of 1 billion between Calgary and Edmonton.
Is this on?
Can we get that mic on? Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
Good.
it's
Just
on.
bring it
All right.
close.
Yeah, and the difference in loss is just, yeah, it's good question, because Calgary's bigger than Edmonton, has a larger economy, more population, larger inventory. But with the Edmonton study, we considered impacts upon more of the systems within the city. So looking at things like some of the treatment plants, where that was omitted from the Calgary study because we didn't have the damage functions. Within Edmonton, we also looked at a wider range of natural assets than we did within the Calgary study, and then also considered the impacts associated with a wider range of climate hazards. So in Calgary, for example, we didn't look at high winds or hail, whereas within the Edmonton study we did. So it's just to do with the scope, really, reflecting the difference.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and whoever caught that one, good question. We have a question here at the back. Please introduce yourself.
I will do, thanks. Lanielle Bateman of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And my question is for Amber. I really appreciated your presentation, and in our work, I'm working on the National Adaptation Strategy. We are trying to start to deliver those messages. And so I often give a presentation that says the stable climate that we rely on is over, and starting to plan for the future. And I think you were quoting some of the research that we did, public opinion research from our team. So that was fun too. But my question I wanted to ask you is, as we're looking at the National Adaptation Strategy and trying to make it real and relevant for Canadians and the implementation and involve them and be part of it, we are finding that there's not as much research in the adaptation space. That on mitigation, there's been a lot more. And I just wondered if you had more insight into that. I think we're going to be starting to develop a baseline, but just wondered if you could comment from your expertise in this area about the relative scope of research across the different files, and if you're seeing more coming in the adaptation space. Thanks.
Related to Am I on?
It should be turned on. We checked.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can you hear me?
No.
I'll just speak loud.
No, I think we want to make sure, because for the online guests. Yeah,
There we go. Looks like a press conference. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of really interesting researchers who are thinking about how we talk about risk, how we talk about loss from a communications perspective. I'm happy to share some of those with you. But I think the big, what's kind of common across the board is that the suite of tools that we use to deliver difficult conversations is eased a lot by community conversation. So allowing people to kind of work through their own understanding of risk and their own understanding of loss, not only just as individuals, but as a collective community, is one of the most powerful ways that people can kind of move through this. So the biggest motivator for both mitigation and adaptation, and I'm sorry, this is very touchy-feely, is kind of, it's love. Right? People, it's the risk of the loss of what they love, whether it's culture or family or community or their home or whatever it is. We are more motivated by loss of the things that we love than we are by what we might gain through investing in it. So there's quite a bit of research, and I'm happy to share it with you, but it all kind of focuses and centers around how we as human beings interpret and what is our motivation for action. And it comes through not wanting to lose the things that we love.
Amazing. And it's okay to say love at ClimateWest. No, very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so what else do we have for questions from the audience or from our virtual audience? Can we get a mic over here? Elsa, thanks a lot. Just introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Hi there, Jason Bell, City of Winnipeg Parks. I'm curious in your modeling, so that I think this, are you looking at what the impacts locally, regionally beyond that may be on your model? So if we did everything we could, what influences potential outcomes or limits some of the projections that you've made?
You want to take a crack at it? Rock, paper, scissors, both of you?
I imagine we both have something to say about this. I guess from our perspective, looking at things at a national scale, like I mentioned, some of the international effects of climate change on other countries and other parts of the world aren't brought into that. So, for example, if the price of food went up dramatically because agriculture starts failing in many parts of the world that we import from, that's not built into our models of economic damage and loss. So yeah, I think that's why it's important to reinforce that we only know that tip of the iceberg right now. And that we should only assume that it's going to be worse than what we can estimate at present. And so we should sort of act accordingly, invest, get ahead of it as much as we can.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that all of the modeling results that I showed you, you're looking at the direct effect, like biophysical impacts of climate change on the city of Winnipeg, for example. And then there may be some cascading impacts from those impacts in Winnipeg outside of the city, but it's only the impacts within the city that are quantified. And so it's kind of like Winnipeg is a climate taker. The only thing that can change from an international perspective as an input is the climate itself. Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, this looks like an interesting question from our online, and then we'll go to here. So online, we got a couple thumbs up. So Amber, if you had $50,000 budget and 2 people on your team, where would you start to begin a climate communications project? So where would you start this project? In the Prairies?
That seems like a very specific question. I honestly think it has to, I mean, I think my colleagues would agree. You need to do research, and research doesn't have to be expensive, but you really do need to understand who it is that you want to talk to, because people who are making decisions, who are elected officials, are different than people who are administrators or bureaucrats, who are different than the general public, who again are different than different professional industry associations. So prioritizing with $50,000, I would take 10% of that and I would put it towards research. And it doesn't have to be expensive. You can just invite people into meetings. You could do interviews with people, et cetera, and get really clear about what their priorities are, what they care about, what they're thinking about, what their concerns are. And then I would take a portion of that and I would put it towards some sort of engagement or dialogue or some way that you are working with the group that you are trying to influence or try to motivate. And then the rest of it, you could probably put towards doing a really good job of plain languaging and providing your information in different ways and in different formats. think about illustration, think about video, think about really basic, tangible, plain language, and then think about the things that you already have available to you. The Prairie Climate Center video library is amazing. Like the best practices in place are really, they're best practice. So any of those resources I think are really important and should be leveraged. And we don't have the time or the money to recreate the wheel. So that's what I would do. So some research, some ways of working together with the people that you're trying to influence, and then getting your information in different ways out to people.
Great advice. Thank you. Sure. Go ahead, Richard.
That because I found it surprising that some of the priorities that people identify with, like affordability, inflation, job security, I would like to understand why they can't make the link between that and the role that climate change plays in contributing to that, and trying to understand that from a communications perspective. Because if they want to see solutions to those problems, they also have to think about, well, how do we deal with climate change? Because climate change is just making all those problems worse.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that for many people, when you are in focus groups and you're talking about climate change and you're talking about climate change solutions, what they're talking about is recycling and plastic bags and plastic straws. And so there is a real discrepancy between our understanding of the problems and the solutions that are available for us. So going back to those kind of messengers who can talk about real, practical, tangible things, I think is really important. And I'm a big believer of layering education onto actions, right? So give people a way to act. And then while you're doing that, you provide them the connections between what it is they're doing and how it connects to the bigger problem, and how it also connects to the goals that are have been set, for the community, writ large.
And we are taking good notes of all these tips of how to communicate this information out, because that is exactly the challenge. A question over here.
Hi, it's Joanna Aiken from the Intech Centre. I just wondered whether any of the panelists have their insights on how we make the message more positive, because I think Amber mentioned, the negative messaging is not working very well. And, we're talking about costs, but avoided costs are actually benefits. So I do a lot of work on looking at valuing co-benefits. Like realistically, many of our adaptation projects have many other benefits, like redevelopment of urban areas, improvement of natural infrastructure, which has health benefits, making life better. And I feel like we could be reframing. I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that.
Any thoughts on reframing to the positive and using that as a way to communicate? Any thoughts? You want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, I think, so I think, I have two thoughts. One, when I talk about narrative, what I'm talking about is not a headline or a message. It is the way that we are making sense of the information that we're hearing, right? So my personal opinion is that we need to shift the public narrative so that when they encounter information, they are making sense of it through the understanding that we are never going back to the way it was, that things will only get worse. That's not to say we're going to go out with an advertising campaign that is like, the world is going to shit and we're all dying. But through individual conversations or through the work that we're doing, I think it's really important that people are exposed to and are beginning and are able to make sense of why we're making these decisions, why we're talking about costs, why we're talking about the costs of inaction is because the climate has changed and it will only continue to get changed. That's a meta narrative that we need to lay down the tracks. And until we do that, we're going to consistently bump up against resistance because people don't understand why are you prioritizing that over these other things that I have. That said, also, I think positive messaging, people want to feel like governments are taking care of them. They want to understand and feel that they're part of a collective community of people who are acting and who are acting together to protect the things that they love. So I think the hope and the positivity comes through action with each other and in community. And the positive part of it is that we are able to protect the things that we value and that we love. But until people can hear messages and understand and situate them within that larger narrative of the climate has changed and will continue to change, I think we're going to have difficulties spurring action. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Good answer.
I would,
One more question? Did I
Sure, I
hear?
think-
Oh, go ahead,
yeah,
Richard.
yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to say that probably like, well, the work that Ryan and I do, we would try to capture quantitatively or qualitatively all of the co-benefits and convey them as additional benefits. But I was thinking like going back to the affordability, the inflation and health, safety, those things which are priorities for people. You can maybe present adaptation as a beneficial opportunity to try and secure some of those other objectives when really, and then sort of like the secondary or co-benefit of making things more affordable is the fact that you're also adapting. So just present or reverse how it's presented. So we're trying to increase public health, public security. We're trying to increase or improve the affordability of living standards and stuff like that, and maybe present it adaptation as that, as opposed to you're adapting to climate change.
And
Yeah.
just to add to that, I think we've been successful in, at least for the public facing part of our work, to use affordability as sort of an anchor message to help people understand why adaptation is important. So I agree with that, Richard. I was going to say as well that I don't know if we need to always shy away or obscure from the negative part of this message. Public policymakers, at least good ones, should be receptive to that kind of information and should be making decisions to help society avoid risk. I guess what we need to ensure is that we have an electorate that keeps voting for good policymakers and not policymakers who are going to bury their heads in the sand. So I agree. There's probably a role there for some balance in encouraging voters to vote for politicians who will take action on climate change, but I guess to feel that there's some hope in doing so as well.
Amber?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. It's like we need to invest in, good infrastructure. We need to invest in water security. We need to invest in, good healthcare. We need to invest in the things that people care about. That's all positive. And it's much more tangible for people than saying we're investing in climate adaptation. People just there's no mental model laid down for them to understand what that is. But the positive things that are specific and tangible and that are practical, I think people, if you ask people what they care about, climate change or, forest fires or water security or those things. So tangible, practical things and investing in those, I think, or the risk or the loss that might happen. Just getting specific helps a lot.
Okay, so many questions and people that want to talk on this topic. So do we want to take a coffee break at some point? We're going to take one more question from Sabine, and then we're going to take a super fast break and come back so that we can hear from Lanielle. And then we have a great discussion forum after that for you all to talk about this more. We knew this would really spark a lot of interest and talk. So go ahead, Sabine.
Yeah, thanks.
Last question.
Sabina Dietz. I'm from ClimateAtlantic out in Atlantic Canada. So this is more a reflecting on your meta message, Amber. And you know, I totally understand where we need to move away or where we need to move to. But I want to highlight that I have two daughters in their 20s, early 30s, and my eldest daughter is not going to have kids because of climate change. So I would just want to highlight the mental health effects that when we decide to change narrative, that we need to be very conscious of the younger generation. I've also worked extensively with 14, 16, 17-year-olds that cannot vote yet. And so I'm stuck in this. I fully support that shift because we need to make that, but we need to be also very cautious on how we do that and how it lands in the next generation and the next generation, because those following generations are impacted so much more by what we message, and our message to the decision makers need to be so different than to the young people. And yet our young people are engaged with decision makers. So how do you avoid the impact that how we need to talk to the decision makers, whether it's engineers or elected officials or administrators, how that impacts our young people? Because I think we need to be super cautious, not saying to avoid it, but there is a lot of, it's not as simplistic as it sounds when we include the next generations.
The last word, and then we're going to take a quick break.
I agree. I also think that they know, and part of the reason why they're so freaked out is because they know and they don't think we're doing anything about it. And so part of this is getting real. This is happening. And here are the things that we are doing to prepare, to protect, to create safety and security, et cetera. So there is the part of this is that, like, it's just not, we're not going to like full stop, climate is changing and it's going to get worse. Climate is changing, it's going to get worse. And we are preparing and we're protecting and we are acting on your behalf. We are not abandoning you to a bad future. So I think it's both. And the kind of the action part of it and the motivation to act that comes through is that we as adults or as decision makers or as governments or economists, et cetera, also care about this. And here's the evidence and here are the things that we're doing to prepare and protect and invest in it, et cetera. So it's acknowledging it and then also moving through that into action.
Thank you. Good last word.